talk to you about programmatic evolution and how we believe that this is making consumer experiences better. So for us to do that, we're going to talk to you about two things. One is going to be the advertiser point of view, and the other is going to be the publisher point of view. So before we start, we're going to take a step back and look at the evolution of digital media. So we started in a world of insertion order-based transactions between advertisers and publishers, moved to the world of network buys, and then to the evolution of programmatic and open RTV. And what happened was we arrived at a place where advertisers had the ability to sort of cherry pick impressions at scale really cheaply. And what that did was that put increasing pressure on publisher margins and publisher revenue. And so in return, what they responded with was more ads and worse ad experiences.
So as you think about those more ads and worse ad experiences, there was absolutely a point where the saturation of ads in the marketplace did impact our consumer response. And think about yourselves as consumers. By 2009, we saw the rise of ad blocking as a response, as a direct response against the saturation of ads that were irrelevant in the marketplace. So just by a quick show of hands, how many of you are currently today using an ad blocker? Okay, 1, 2, 3.
2.
About 20%, which is where we are today. About 20% of desktop users are actively using an ad blocker. But we know that, and we know that that is the truth and the reality of the marketplace that we sit in today. And consumers are at a point that we're really demanding, we as individuals are really demanding those relevant experiences from brands. Not just in how we're being targeted, but in the environment in which we are being talked to and talking with advertisers. And so we're at a point today where there needs to be a convergence between audience and inventory. So we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about that convergence and what that means for you all as advertisers and how to take advantage of it. So starting with the inventory. So we like to think about inventory being bought and sold on a scale. So on the very far right side, you have digital direct reservation buying. So this is your IO, direct with a publisher, New York Times, I sign the IO, I buy the placements, and I'm guaranteeing the amount of impressions and the cost in which I'm buying those impressions. There's no audience targeting in that. On the far left side is the extreme. Only audience targeting, absolutely no control over the inventory in which you as an advertiser might appear.
So as programmatic has evolved, we're now at a place where we have what's called private marketplaces, and these are mechanisms that now allow advertisers and publishers to transact in a number of different capacities, but ultimately in a way that's more mutually beneficial. So taking all of the really great things from the digital reservation buy around securing placement, securing price, and securing contextual alignment with the ability to then pick and choose and buy audiences that you got from the open exchange, but in many cases do it on your own terms as well. So there exists now mechanisms such as a private auction or preferred deals or programmatic guaranteed that ultimately create a more mutually beneficial transaction between advertisers and publishers.
So before we jump in and everybody rushes out of the room and says, I'm going to go buy a private marketplace, we feel like we need to give you a few of our key principles in order to do that. So first and foremost, as we heard yesterday, this is true in programmatic and very true when we think about buying private marketplaces. Data should inform every single impression that you put in market. Testing before you invest, we now have the tools and the capacity to actually test before we strategically and significantly invest with certain publishers. Trust and safety is still paramount. We're going to talk about ad verification, our favorite topic. And then optimize, making sure that this isn't a set it and forget it. We're on every day making sure that we're advancing in the placements and the audiences in which we're targeting.
So first principle, data informs all the decisions that you make. We now have tools such as Sage Plus, which is powered by Accordance ATS technology, and the Merkle M1 database that allow us to onboard first-party client data, and before we ever buy a single impression in market, evaluate your first-party audiences against publishers, against audiences in the open marketplace. And in this example, a client onboards their first-party CRM database, and before they ever buy a single impression, they're able to identify publishers and domains that score and highly index against their actual audiences to inform their media plan.
So secondly, test before you invest. So while it's really beneficial for us to start to use the tools and technology to understand what different sites your consumers and customers are going to, the other thing that we know is true that for specific advertisers, there are just some places that you want to align contextually. There are some publishers that you as a brand want to have your brand appear. So test before you invest. So let's consider this. Let's say you are a luxury advertiser. What we know from the tools and technology that Justin just mentioned is that your customers are actually reading CNN religiously and the Zoe report, but you as a brand really want to be in Vanity Fair and Arc Digest. And Vanity Fair CPM today in a reservation buy is actually $27. So that's a really steep investment when we think about going direct to Vanity Fair to test them. So what we can do is actually we will create a private marketplace, but then refine that list, reduce the underperforming sites, and then most importantly, invest significantly in the sites that you know are performing for your brand.
So the third principle is trust and safety is still paramount. So just because we now have a more open and transparent relationship with publishers as advertisers doesn't mean that we can just rest on our laurels. So all of the great strategies and technologies that we deployed in an open exchange marketplace still apply when it comes to private marketplaces. So ensuring that there's no fraud, ensuring that viewability is high, audience validation, et cetera, are still paramount when we're thinking about this new programmatic buying option.
And finally, our fourth principle is optimizing with speed and efficiency. So no surprise, like every other digital media channel, we like to optimize, but we like to be in market faster. So let's consider this old way of buying in a direct, traditional digital reservation buy. It would have taken us potentially 2 weeks to RFP a publisher, up to a week to actually review those proposals, another day, another week to negotiate those rates, and ultimately we're reliant on the publisher to actually publish our ads, which could take us up to a month from inception to when we're in market. In this private marketplace and buying this inventory programmatically, we actually eliminate the majority of those steps, and we go straight from sourcing the inventory to confirming a CPM to being in market in as little as 3 days. And the other key thing is that we're not stopping there. We can continue on the fly on a daily or hourly basis to refine those sites and really make sure that we're in the best contextual environment for your brands. So we've done this with Hilton. So Hilton has a very robust programmatic strategy and a really robust audience segmentation strategy, but they were struggling with how to alleviate the stress of their open exchange inventory. They were putting a significant investment in that audience buying without considering the context in which the audience they were targeting. And so they created a private marketplace of 22 sites. They created the 22 sites out of the best performing sites from their open exchange. And by investing in those 22 sites, they actually increased their impression reach on those 22 sites through the preferred deal by 125%. But what was more interesting is by having that balance between their open exchange buy as well as the private marketplace buy, their overall ROI increased by 24% because they weren't stressing that open exchange inventory so drastically. And then finally, they considered and looked at apples to apples, the sites that they put in the private marketplace versus the sites that they historically had a digital reservation buy with. And when you looked at that same site, apples to apples, they actually were able to decrease the overall CPM by 31% and thus increasing their ROI by 63% just by changing the way in which they were buying that inventory.
So we talked to you about the programmatic evolution from the advertiser point of view. We don't often talk about how this looks from the publisher point of view. So if we think about the publisher landscape and how this has changed over time, there's always existed this traditional sort of trade-off between scale and efficiency and the premium nature of the publisher's inventory. And over time, as publishers look to sort of balance the scale of networks versus direct buys, and then as the open exchange sort of proliferated and drove down their margins even more, they were able to recapture some of that revenue and that margin with private marketplaces. However, there's actually some even more interesting innovations that are happening as we speak that are super relevant to the publisher side that I think are going to further accelerate this evolution and make this value exchange between publishers and advertisers even better. And what we're talking about really is this idea of dynamic allocation. So If you think about the traditional publisher waterfall, the direct buy traditionally always set at the top of the publisher's priority. So for every single ad impression, the first look would go to, is there a reservation buy that was sold on a direct sold basis? And if so, send that impression to the publisher or to the advertiser. Then from there, it cascaded down across private marketplaces and then sort of into the remnant open exchange inventory. But the challenge with that is in a waterfall, you're setting priorities based on buying mechanisms, not based on an advertiser's willingness to pay for that individual impression or the value that they place on that impression. And so with dynamic allocation, what you essentially do is you collapse all of those and you look at them at the same time to see where is the highest bid coming in and which advertiser values this user or this impression the most. So an example of how this works and how this is beneficial for all parties is in a traditional waterfall scenario, open exchange bid of $15 would always be trumped by a $10 bid on a direct sold basis. However, with dynamic allocation, not only does the $15 bid win, but the revenue to the publisher is actually $13 and a penny because the buyer and the open exchange pays a penny more than the next highest bid. So as you can see, not only does that benefit the publisher, but from an advertiser point of view, we've already stated that we're willing to pay more than anyone else for this impression, so no longer block us from what we deem as a more relevant user. And ultimately, that creates a more relevant experience for consumers.
So that's a really important thing when we think about where we are today and how that landscape has changed so that we do have the right convergence of audience and inventory. It is beneficial for both the advertiser as well as the publisher, and we're creating those relevant experiences for our consumers. So eMarketer actually published a study saying that, or a survey saying that in 2018, 73% of programmatic inventory, or 73% of inventory will be sold programmatically. Not too surprising for all of us sitting in the room. We know that programmatic is on the rise, but the more important and kind of interesting statistic for us was that actually almost 50% of that inventory will be sold via PMPs. So we know that there is a demand both from publishers as well as advertisers to release inventory and to buy inventory in a right way that really does give that relevant experience to our consumers. And the last statistic we have here is that we know that there are some of you that are using ad blockers today, and that will not change. We know that that is true. Last year, the growth of ad blocking adoption was at 20%. This year, it's only 16%. So while we know ad blocking is still on the rise, that growth rate has declined. And we're seeing that consumers are starting to understand that advertisers and publishers really do want to find, genuinely want to find that relevant experience for their customers. So we walked through a lot today. We want to walk through our kind of key points and takeaway before you walk out of this room and forget everything. So first and foremost, private marketplaces are here. They're not going anywhere. If anything, they're just going to get more advanced, and we'll have different ways to buy and access inventory that hasn't existed yesterday. But it's important for us to start leveraging them, especially when we think about how to efficiently test different placements for you and for your brand.
The second piece is data and technology. So it's not enough to just walk out of this room and say, I need a private marketplace strategy. You also need to have a data strategy, and you need to find the right technology partners that allows you to take advantage of this evolution. There are a lot of publishers out there with a lot of different awesome audiences and data sets, and a lot of great technologies that allow you to access those. And so working with a core group or a trusted group of technology partners and data partners is the way to take full advantage of this new evolution.
And finally, it is really important for us to create those relevant experiences with our customers. The ability to do that with the tools and technology and the buying mechanisms which exist in programmatic today are here and will continue to evolve. But we as marketers and advertisers need to take advantage of that because they are better today than they were yesterday, and they will continue to accelerate your brand and your business. So with that, we will open it up. That was very dense, I'm sure. So with that, we will open it up to questions to anybody who is willing to ask a question about private marketplaces. No questions? Well, we get one all the time, which I'll just share with you, which is I am a brand that has traditionally bought my display via direct IO. And so are you just telling me that I should completely forget that and I should completely invest in a private marketplace? Well, the answer is no. As we mentioned, when we think about inventory being bought and sold on that scale, it's not about one or the other. It's about the right combination of taking advantage of everything from the open exchange to the private marketplaces and even those direct reservation buys. There's still equity to be had and equity with those publisher partnerships, and we don't want to lose sight of that. But we want to find the right balance so that we are testing strategically and finding the right places for your brand to be without investing with significant risk.
So are you saying testing is the way to find the right balance then?
It definitely is. I think testing kind of the combination, as we saw in the Hilton example, it took them a while to figure out what the right sites in the private marketplace were. And it was a constant, everyday change of this site's working, this site's not. But it does require the right testing of what is it in my open exchange that I can understand, and what are the sites that are really performing, and how do I start to invest in those a little bit more, and then how do I start investing in those really strategically as a partnership? That's the right way to look at kind of your media mix from an inventory buy.
How long was that testing period, and what would you say to our clients what to expect in terms of how long to test?
Yeah, so actually that campaign, so they launched it at the end of December. Their first week in, they started changing the sites. So they started with a site list of 25 sites. The first week in, it changed, and it was still 25 sites, but the sites that they had in there changed. And over the course of about 3 weeks was when those results we saw were over 3 weeks. But they're still changing the sites today. So that's the other thing that's really interesting is that your consumers, they're people. They're not only reading on the New York Times, or they're not only going to kayak.com. They change their behavior, and depending on kind of your interaction with them, their behavior on different sites changes as well. And so the point is that actually it's not really an ongoing test anymore, it's just an ongoing optimization. And that's kind of the status quo in which we're living today, is that those sites change on a continual basis.
Would you have a different set of sites for different segments?
Yes, so not always, and it completely varies, I think, by the advertiser.
Yeah, it varies by the advertiser.
I know that in some cases, some brands have, very luxury or very kind of high-end, super high-value audiences. And so while you might see that that audience is reading similar content as maybe your freemium audience or premium, whatever kind of free, low end of the spectrum audience, there are other sites that maybe you want to invest a little bit more strategically for that premium audience. Like maybe you want to actually be in a higher, more premium, contextually relevant environment that's very different from the audience that's, this freemium audience. So it definitely can change. Yes.
So you said you're updating sites regularly, right? So what is informing the new list of sites? Is it just guests, or is your programmatic partners then furnishing, and then that's what you're adding to the PMP? How does that process work?
So that's us.
And we talked about the data strategies that we deploy. So we take the data that we receive, and we have the ability to then look at the entire marketplace and say, okay, if I reach this in-market demo with campaign A, then let's take those users and find where else they are in the marketplace, whether it's through Merkle's M1 database or Sage Plus, et cetera. And it's sort of a different way to think about lookalikes, except for it's actual user, your user data from the previous campaign to inform the next publishers that you're looking to buy.
So it's a platform where you put in you're seeing the conversions, and then that will tell you where it's kind of popping on other sites.
Yeah.
The conversions, as well as where your ads are actually being placed and who's responding to them in which different environments, right? So it's kind of an ongoing. We can look at your audience segmentation and where they are kind of in the wild in the internet, but then also where your ads are showing and how consumers are responding in an organic way and also in a paid way.
So does that help give some validity to also having when you have a private marketplace, also having open market too, because you can put a little out there, kind of see what's resonating differently than the PMP, and then say, hey, this one's doing really well, let's throw that back in.
That's why the balance is so important. And in that Hilton example, they didn't just guess on the sites that go into the private marketplace. It was all based on what they were seeing within the open exchange to say, we're really starting to see users interact with our advertisements on kayak.com. Now let's start to create that and put that site in this preferred deal and invest a little bit more strategically in that site to increase our performance.
The other thing too is if you think about it from the publisher point of view, which we don't often do, on any given day, the inventory that they're making available could be extremely weighted toward the open exchange or it could be heavily based on the direct sold. And a lot of that direct sold is essentially based on their ad sales team's ability to go out and sell it, right? So whereas today, we might feel really good about our PMP strategy with CNN.com. Tomorrow, there might be a flood of CNN inventory that we can get for a lot cheaper. And if we don't have an open exchange strategy, then we can't take advantage of that. So.
All right, well, we hope you enjoyed. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.